The clock on the office wall read exactly 3:40 in the afternoon when Michael Thompson felt the first sharp pang of pain that would change his life forever. His fingers, which moments earlier had been gliding firmly over important documents, now trembled slightly over the polished mahogany desk. The business empire he had built over 30 years stood around him, materialized in the glass walls of the 47th floor, but for the first time in decades, Michael felt small in the face of the vast city stretching out beyond his window. The pain, initially a subtle annoyance, had begun a few weeks earlier. Sarah, his 20-year-old wife, 20 years younger than him, as they made a point to mention at charity galas, insisted it was just stress. "You work too much, darling," she would say, her green eyes conveying a concern that Michael now started to question, wondering if it was genuine. Every gesture of affection, every small attention that once made him feel loved, now carried a different weight in his memory. His marriage to Sarah had been a topic of debate in his social circle. Many saw her as an opportunist, a young, ambitious woman who had won the heart and fortune of one of the most powerful businessmen on the East Coast. But Michael had seen something different in her. A liveliness, a sharp intelligence that made him feel alive again after years of loneliness following the death of his first wife. That particular afternoon, as the shadows of neighboring skyscrapers began to stretch across his office, something felt different. The pain wasn't just physical, it carried a weight, a sensation that something fundamental was about to crumble. James Parker, his partner and friend of 30 years, had just left his office after a meeting about the new merger they were planning. "Leave it all to me. You need to rest," were his last words, spoken with that tone of concern that now sounded false in Michael's ears. His friendship with James went back to the early days of Thompson Enterprises, when they were just two young dreamers with big ambitions. Together, they had turned a small investment firm into a globally respected financial conglomerate. James had always been the strategist, the man with the political and social connections, while Michael was the driving force, the visionary who turned possibilities into reality. James's excessive care in recent months, which had once seemed like a demonstration of friendship, now took on new dimensions in Michael's mind. The cups of tea Sarah religiously prepared every morning, James's sudden interest in personally managing the new contracts, the frequent calls from his secretary asking if he needed anything, everything began to form a disturbing pattern. Michael stood with difficulty, leaning on the desk. His reflection in the window's glass showed a man still imposing at 55 years old, but with deep dark circles under his eyes and a pallor that didn't match his usual vitality. His graying hair, which once gave him an air of distinction, now appeared whiter, marked by the weight of the suspicions that were starting to take shape. The empire he had built was known for its solidity in the financial market. Thompson Enterprises had survived economic crises, corporate scandals, and hostile takeover attempts. Michael had always prided himself on his ability to foresee threats and neutralize them before they became real problems. But now, as he watched the frantic movement of the city below, a sense of vulnerability consumed him. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Elena Martinez, his new secretary, entered with a folder of documents and her usual helpful expression. Elena had been hired only 6 months earlier, after the sudden retirement of Margaret, his trusted secretary of 2 decades. Another change that, in retrospect, seemed suspiciously convenient. "Mr. Thompson, Dr. Rachel Morgan is here to see you." I know she wasn't scheduled, but she insisted that it's urgent. The mention of the doctor's name made Michael straighten up instinctively. Rachel Morgan wasn't just another member of his medical team, she was one of the few people who still treated him like a human being, not a walking empire. In recent months, as his health mysteriously deteriorated, she had been the only one to show a concern that seemed genuinely professional. "Let her in, Elena," he replied, adjusting the navy blue tie Sarah had chosen for him that morning. A detail that, like so many others, now seemed laden with hidden meanings. Even the choice of colors for his clothes had gradually shifted into Sarah's hands, a process so subtle that he had barely noticed the loss of this small control over his life. Rachel entered the room with her usual restrained energy. At 40, she carried with her an aura of competence that transcended her impeccable white coat and professional demeanor. Her brown eyes, always observant, quickly assessed Michael, and her expression shifted into something he couldn't fully decipher. "Michael," she began, bypassing the formalities that usually colored their professional interactions, "we need to talk about your recent tests." The tone in her voice made Michael's heart race. Rachel wasn't the type to make surprise visits without a very serious reason. She approached the desk, placing a folder onto the polished surface. The sound of paper against wood seemed amplified in the tense silence of the room. "Something in your blood," she continued, choosing her words carefully, isn't normal. And I'm not just talking about the symptoms you've been experiencing. There's a pattern here that—" She hesitated, something rare for her usually assertive demeanor, suggests this isn't natural. Michael felt the air grow heavier. Memories from the past months began to rearrange themselves in his mind. The lunches Sarah insisted on preparing herself, going against years of restaurant habits. The meetings that James frequently rescheduled, always coinciding with times when Michael felt particularly unwell. "What exactly are you saying, Rachel?" "I'm saying," she lowered her voice, leaning in closer, "that you're being poisoned. Systematically. And from the time it took me to detect this, it's clear that it's someone who knows exactly what they're doing." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, the city continued its frenetic pace, unaware that Michael Thompson's world was beginning to crumble. Rachel's words hung in the air like a sentence, confirming fears he had barely dared admit to himself. "Who?" was all he managed to ask, his voice weaker than he would have liked. Rachel leaned over the desk, her eyes locked on his. "That's the question Detective Marcus Bennett is going to help us answer. He's waiting in my office. Right now." "Michael," she paused, placing a hand on his arm, "you need to trust me. Your life depends on it." Michael looked out at the city once more, the lights beginning to flicker in the buildings as evening descended. His empire, built with such determination, now felt like a fortress of glass, seemingly solid but terribly fragile. Somewhere, maybe even inside his own home, someone was executing a meticulous plan to destroy him. The pain returned, sharper this time, as if his body wanted to emphasize the urgency of the situation. Michael turned back to Rachel, realizing that she might be his only true ally in that moment. In his office, surrounded by symbols of power and success, he had never felt so vulnerable and alone. "What do we need to do?" he asked, his voice regaining some of the firmness that defined him. Rachel smiled faintly, but her eyes remained serious. "First, we need to keep you alive. Then we'll find out who's behind this. And Michael." She hesitated again, "You won't like what we uncover." The sun began to set over the city, casting long shadows through the office windows. Michael Thompson, the man who had always controlled his destiny, now found himself at the beginning of a battle for survival. A battle where his most dangerous enemies might be the very ones he trusted the most. As he put the documents into his briefcase, his hands still trembling slightly, Michael realized that his life had changed forever. Every relationship, every trust he had built over the years, would have to be reevaluated. The truth, he suspected, would be as bitter as the poison running through his veins. Dr. Rachel Morgan's office was a sanctuary of tranquility amidst the chaos of the medical center. Michael gazed through the window on the 10th floor, looking out at the same streets he used to see from his office, but the perspective was now different. Lower, closer to the reality he had distanced himself from over the years. Marcus Bennett was not what Michael had expected from a private detective. Tall, with neatly trimmed gray hair and a well-tailored suit, he could easily pass as one of the executives who frequented Thompson Enterprises meetings. His eyes, however, carried a sharpness that Michael recognized immediately. It was the same look he saw in the mirror during the toughest negotiations of his career. "Mr. Thompson," Bennett began, his voice calm and controlled, "Dr. Morgan has brought me up to speed on the situation. First, we need to establish your daily routine. Every detail could be important." Michael sat in the leather armchair, feeling the weight of the past few months on his shoulders. "Sarah, my wife, she always prepares my breakfast. It's a ritual of ours since we married. The green tea she insists will help me live longer." A bitter smile crossed his lips as he realized the irony in his last statement. Rachel, standing by her desk, exchanged a meaningful glance with Bennett. "Michael, we need to talk about Sarah," she said softly. "The toxicology tests we did show higher concentrations of the toxic agent after your morning meals." The silence that followed was heavy. Michael closed his eyes, remembering the first time he met Sarah. It was a charity gala night and she was working on the event. Her smile lit up the room in a way he hadn't seen since the death of Elizabeth, his first wife. Sarah had that ability to make everyone around her feel special, important. "James," Michael said abruptly, opening his eyes. He and Sarah, they've been spending a lot of time together over the past few months. Meetings about the company's social projects, she said. But now, Bennett made some notes on his tablet. "We need to be discreet in our investigation. If they're really working together on this, any suspicion could accelerate their plans." "The symptoms started gradually," Rachel interjected, picking up a file from her desk. "First it was dizziness, then chronic fatigue. Michael lost weight, developed occasional tremors. Symptoms that could easily be attributed to the stress of managing a corporate empire. And they were, Michael finished, frustration evident in his voice. Sarah insisted I needed to slow down. James started taking on more responsibilities at the company. Elena, my new secretary, was practically imposed by them after Margaret's sudden retirement. Bennett frowned. Margaret? Your former secretary? 22 years of service. She retired abruptly 6 months ago, right after I started feeling ill. Sarah said she organized a farewell party, but I was too unwell to attend. We need to find Margaret, Bennett declared, his professional tone masking the underlying urgency. She might have crucial information. Rachel approached Michael, her eyes conveying genuine concern. In the meantime, we'll start a treatment to neutralize the effects of the poison. But Michael, you need to be extremely careful with what you eat and drink. Absolutely nothing from unreliable sources. How can I continue living under the same roof as Sarah? Michael asked, the vulnerability in his voice surprising even himself. How can I sit at the table with her every morning knowing? You need to act, Michael, Bennett intervened firmly. Your life depends on it. Keep up your routine as normal, but don't consume anything she prepares. Find excuses, morning meetings, early appointments. As for James, keep him close. The old saying has never been truer. Keep your friends close and your enemies even closer. Michael stood up, walking to the window. The afternoon sun bathed the buildings in golden hues, creating an illusion of warmth that contrasted with the cold he felt inside. Somewhere in that city, his wife and his best friend were possibly plotting his death. The idea was as absurd as it was terrifying. There's one more thing, Rachel said, her voice hesitant. I found something interesting in Sarah's medical records. Before marrying you, she worked as a research assistant in a pharmaceutical lab. Specialization? Toxicology. The revelation hit Michael like a punch. Memories of casual conversations with Sarah about her past, always vague, always quickly changing the subject, now took on new meaning. How many other lies had she told? How many truths had she hidden? Dr. Morgan, Elena entered the office after a brief knock on the door. Mrs. Thompson is in the reception. She says she came to pick up her husband for dinner. The momentary panic in Michael's eyes was quickly replaced by a mask of normalcy, a skill that years of tough negotiations had taught him. Bennett and Rachel exchanged worried glances. It's time to start your act, Michael, Bennett said softly. Remember, normal, casual, no suspicions. We'll monitor every step they take. Michael adjusted his tie, an automatic gesture that always helped him regain composure. How will I know who to trust? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. Rachel stepped closer, placing a small device in his pocket. This is a disguised heart rate monitor. Keep it with you at all times. Any significant change and we'll know. You're not alone in this, Michael. Before leaving the office, Michael looked at the two of them, the dedicated doctor and the sharp detective who had now become his lifeline in a world where all his certainties had crumbled. Bennett gave a slight nod, a silent gesture of support. Darling. Sarah's melodic voice sounded through the reception as Michael stepped out of the office. She approached, her heels echoing on the marble floor, her expensive perfume enveloping him as it always did. I was worried. You didn't answer my calls? Michael forced a smile, aware of the small device in his pocket, aware of the eyes watching him through the slightly ajar door of the office. Sorry, darling. The appointment took longer than expected. Sarah intertwined her arm with his, her familiar touch now carrying a new kind of danger. Let's go home. I made that soup you love. As they walked toward the elevator, Michael felt the weight of every step. His life had turned into a stage, and now he was forced to give the performance of his life. Every smile, every gesture of affection, every word exchanged with Sarah could be the difference between life and death. The elevator descended smoothly, and Michael observed his reflection in the mirror, the seemingly perfect couple. Sarah, radiant in her designer dress, leaning on his arm like the devoted wife everyone believed her to be. And he, the successful businessman, hiding a whirlwind of emotions behind his serene expression. The truth, he realized, was more toxic than any poison she could be using. And as the elevator doors opened into the hospital lobby, Michael Thompson stepped into the most important role of his life, that of the confident husband, completely unaware of the betrayal unfolding in his own home. The Thompson mansion had never seemed so empty to Michael as it did that night. Every room held memories now tinged with doubt, every photograph on the walls told a story he no longer knew if it was true. Sarah moved gracefully through the kitchen, preparing dinner while softly humming, a scene that used to fill his heart with joy but now chilled him to the core. "The wine is at the perfect temperature," Sarah commented, pouring a glass of the red wine Michael so enjoyed. Her green eyes sparkled with the affection he had always considered genuine. "You're very quiet today, darling. Was the appointment not good?" Michael held the glass, observing the dark liquid without bringing it to his lips. "Just tired," he replied, forcing a smile. "Rachel wants to run a few more tests." The phone rang, breaking the moment. It was James, his voice carrying that studied concern that now sounded false to Michael's ears. "I need your signature on some urgent documents. Can I stop by today?" "Of course," Michael replied, noticing how Sarah stopped stirring the pot for a moment when she heard James's name. A subtle gesture, but telling. As they waited for James, Michael mentally went over Bennett's instructions. The detective had been clear. Observe patterns, note suspicious behaviors, but maintain the appearance of normalcy. Michael's life depended on his ability to act. James arrived half an hour later, bringing a folder of documents and his usual cordial smile. Sarah greeted him with familiarity, perhaps too much familiarity, Michael noticed. There was a silent rapport between them, a body language that spoke of shared intimacy. "These are the contracts for the merger with Pacific Corp," James explained, spreading papers across the dining room table. "We need to finalize this by the end of the week." Michael flipped through the documents when a photo fell out of the folder. It was an old one about 5 years ago, showing Sarah and James together at an event Michael didn't recognize. What caught his attention wasn't just the closeness between them in the photo, but the date printed in the corner. 3 years before Michael even met Sarah. "This is..." Michael began, but James quickly grabbed the photo. "Oh, from the Miller Foundation charity event," James explained with studied ease. "Sarah organized several events for them before you two met." Sarah stepped closer, placing a hand on Michael's shoulder. "I didn't tell you about that, darling? It was so long ago." The lie flowed as smoothly as poisoned honey. Michael clearly remembered Sarah saying she had never worked with James before meeting him. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place, revealing a disturbing pattern. The next morning, Bennett was conducting his own investigation. Margaret, Michael's former secretary, was found living in a small coastal town. Her sudden retirement started making more sense when Bennett uncovered records of a generous bank transfer made by a shell company linked to James. "She's willing to talk," Bennett told Michael during a discreet meeting at a quiet cafe. "But she's scared. Apparently, she's had some intimidating visits in the past few weeks." Rachel joined them, bringing more disturbing news. I dug deeper into Sarah's medical history. Not only did she work in toxicology, she was fired after a suspicious incident involving the death of a senior researcher. Michael felt the weight of these revelations in his chest. How did I not see this before? How was I so blind? "Love makes us vulnerable," Rachel replied softly, placing her hand over his. "But it also gives us the strength to face the truth." Bennett consulted his notes. "There's more. James has been making suspicious moves with the company's stock. If anything happens to you, Michael, he takes control of the majority shares. And guess who would be the beneficiary of your life insurance?" "Sarah," Michael murmured, the reality of the betrayal sinking even deeper into his heart. The detective continued, "We found records of meetings between them dating back years before you met Sarah. This wasn't a coincidence, it was a meticulously crafted plan." Michael stood up, walking to the cafe window. The city continued its frantic pace outside, unaware of the drama unfolding. People passed by, living their normal lives while his world collapsed in slow motion. "We need to act fast," Bennett warned. "They may realize something is wrong. The poisoning pattern suggests they're getting more aggressive." Rachel picked up her medical folder. "The latest tests show rising levels of toxicity. Michael, you can't keep living in that house. Every day there is a risk." "And where am I supposed to go?" Michael asked, the vulnerability clear in his voice. "That house, even with all these lies, it's still my home. My apartment has a guest room," Rachel offered without hesitation. "It's safe and I can monitor your health closely." Bennett nodded in approval. "We need you alive to get the missing evidence. Margaret has agreed to testify, but we need more. We need to catch Sarah and James red-handed." Michael returned to the table, his face showing renewed determination. "How do we do that?" "You'll give them exactly what they want," Bennett explained, lowering his voice. "We'll forge some company documents, make it look like you're preparing a major reorganization that would exclude James. They'll act quickly." Rachel protested, "It's too risky. Your health is fragile, Michael." It's our best chance, Bennett insisted. In the meantime, we continued tracking their connections, following the money, building our case. Michael looked at the two of them, the dedicated doctor and the tireless detective, who had become his only true allies. In their eyes, he saw genuine concern, something he hadn't found in the gazes of Sarah or James for a long time. "I'll do whatever it takes," Michael declared, his voice firm despite the trembling in his hands. "But I want them to pay not just for trying to kill me but for turning my life into a lie." That afternoon, as Michael returned to his mansion, now more a prison than a home, he carried with him a new sense of purpose. The pain of betrayal was still there, deep and sharp, but there was something else. A fierce determination to survive, to expose the truth, to rebuild his life from the ashes of this betrayal. Sarah greeted him at the door with her radiant smile. James was in the living room with more urgent documents, and Elena, the secretary, was making diligent notes. The pieces were in place, the actors in their positions. But now Michael knew the true script behind the masks of concern and loyalty. The silent war had begun, and his life was the prize at stake. Rachel's apartment offered a comforting simplicity that starkly contrasted with the empty grandeur of the Thompson mansion. Michael gazed out at the city through the living room window, a cup of tea cooling between his hands. The decision to leave his home had been painful but necessary. Every moment under the same roof as Sarah had become a silent battle for survival. The modest space of the apartment, with its soft-colored walls and comfortable furniture, reflected Rachel's practical personality. Family photos decorated the shelves, genuine moments of joy that made Michael question every photograph in his own house, every smile that now seemed rehearsed, every moment he had once believed to be special. "You need to eat something," Rachel said gently, placing a plate of toast on the table beside him. Her eyes carried a genuine concern that went beyond the medical-patient relationship. In the past few weeks, she had become a safe haven amidst the storm that his life had become. Michael picked up a toast without much enthusiasm, more to appease Rachel's concern than out of hunger. His appetite, like so many other things in his life, had been poisoned by betrayal. "Margaret called," he said finally, turning to face her. "She's willing to tell everything. How James forced her into retirement, the threats, the documents she kept. It seemed she had been suspicious of something for months before she was removed." Rachel sat down on the couch, giving Michael space to process his emotions. The silence between them was comfortable, different from the tense silence that had permeated his last months with Sarah. It was strange how life could change. A doctor he had barely known for a few weeks had now become one of the few people he could completely trust. "Do you know what hurts the most?" Michael continued, his voice low and heavy with sadness. "It's not just the betrayal. It's realizing that every moment I thought was special was carefully planned. Our first meeting, the way Sarah seemed to understand exactly what I needed, it was all a performance." The phone vibrated. It was a message from Sarah. "I miss you, darling. The house is so empty without you. Please come back home." The words, which once would have warmed his heart, now sounded like false notes in a familiar tune. Michael read the message several times, each word a painful reminder of how he had been deceived. Sarah always knew exactly what to say, how to act, which emotional buttons to press. She was a talented manipulator, he had to admit that. Bennett arrived shortly after, carrying a thick folder of documents and a grave expression on his face. His impeccable suit contrasted with the pronounced dark circles under his eyes. Clearly, he wasn't the only one losing sleep over the investigation. "We found something in the old records from the lab where Sarah worked," Bennett began, spreading documents on the coffee table. "The researcher who? Dr. Thomas Anderson. He wasn't just investigating irregularities in drug testing. He had uncovered a much bigger scheme." Rachel picked up the documents, her eyes quickly scanning the pages. "The official report says natural causes, but the symptoms described, they're identical to what Michael presented. The same gradual degradation of systems, the same signs of progressive poisoning." "It wasn't the first case," Bennett continued, spreading photographs on the table. "We found a pattern spanning over a decade. 3 other incidents at different companies where Sarah worked. Executives who mysteriously died after starting to investigate irregularities. All with the same symptoms, all classified as natural death." Michael picked up one of the photos, feeling the weight of the revelation. It was an image of a middle-aged man, smiling at some corporate event. Richard Collins, CEO of Pharmatech, who died in 2015. Next to him in the photo, almost unnoticed in the background, was James, younger but with the same calculated smile that Michael knew so well. James was the common link, Bennett explained, drawing connections between the documents. always in the background but present in every case. Using his connections to suppress investigations, moving money through shell companies, creating perfect alibis. He's the mastermind, Sarah is just his most efficient executor. A well-crafted scam, Rachel murmured, indignation clear in her voice. They target rich executives, gain their trust, and then... It's such a clear pattern now that we can see all the cases together. They turn me into just another statistic, Michael added, bitterness evident in his words. But why wait so long? Sarah and I have been married for 3 years. Bennett picked up another document, a contract with the Pacific Corp logo prominently displayed. Because of the merger. If you die now with the new contract signed, James would gain full control not just of Thompson Enterprises, but would also have significant influence at Pacific Corporation. And Sarah, as his widow, would inherit a substantial fortune. It's the perfect scheme, they just needed to be patient. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made everyone freeze. The apartment door opened, revealing Elena, the secretary. Her face was as pale as paper, her hands visibly trembling. Michael had never seen her so undone. She had always been the picture of professional efficiency. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice barely containing the panic. I can't take it anymore. I need to tell you what I know. Everything." Rachel quickly led her inside, closing the door behind her. Elena collapsed into a chair, tears beginning to stream down her perfectly made-up face. The hands that had always typed with such precision now twisted nervously in her lap. "They hired me to spy on you," she confessed between sobs. "At first it was just reports about your appointments. But then, they started asking me to switch your medications, put things in your coffee. James said it was just to help you calm down, that you were really stressed. I wanted to believe it." Michael felt his stomach churn. Elena had been his secretary for 6 months, serving him coffee every morning, organizing his schedule, having unrestricted access to his office. How many times had she put poison in his drink, following Sarah and James' orders? "Why are you telling us this now?" Bennett asked, his professional tone masking the surprise of the revelation. Elena pulled a small vial from her pocket with trembling hands. "This morning Sarah gave me this. She said it was time to speed up the process. That you were resisting more than expected." Her voice faltered. I can't have someone's death on my conscience. I can't be an accomplice to murder." Rachel carefully took the vial, examining the amber liquid inside. Her eyes widened as she recognized the substance. This is extremely toxic. A single dose would be fatal. They're getting desperate." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Michael looked out the window again, watching the sun set over the city. How many other people had been involved in this plan? How many lives had Sarah and James destroyed in their insatiable pursuit of power and money? "Elena," Bennett said finally, his voice softer, "we need you to help us take them down. Your confession could be the missing piece. With your testimony and this evidence..." The young secretary wiped her tears, leaving dark smudges of mascara on her face. "I'll do whatever it takes. I can't live with this burden. I can't be like them." Michael watched the scene with a mix of gratitude and sadness. Amidst the betrayal and disappointment, there were still people capable of choosing the right path, of listening to their conscience. Elena could have continued with the plan, could have stayed silent, but she chose to do the right thing, even if it meant facing the consequences of her past actions. Rachel gently touched his arm. "This changes everything, Michael. With Elena's testimony and the evidence we already have, we can not only stop them but bring justice for all the previous victims. But we need to act fast," Bennett warned, gathering the documents. "If they realize Elena has betrayed them, if they suspect we know everything, people like Sarah and James don't leave loose ends." Michael stood up, feeling a new strength rising within him. The pain of betrayal was still there, deep and sharp, but now there was something more: hope. The truth, no matter how painful, was finally coming to light, and with it, the possibility of justice. "Then," he said, his voice steady for the first time in weeks, "let's give them exactly what they want. One last meeting, one final chance to show their true faces." The plan began to take shape right there in Rachel's apartment, born from pain and betrayal, but fueled by the hope of justice. In the dimly lit room, 4 people, a betrayed businessman, a dedicated doctor, a relentless detective, and a remorseful secretary, were plotting the end of a conspiracy that had cost too many lives. Night fell over the city, and with it, the promise that the truth, no matter how long it lingered in the shadows, always found its way to the light. The soft light of the late afternoon filtered through the windows of Michael's office, creating elongated shadows that danced across the walls. It was the moment he had chosen for the final confrontation. An apparently routine meeting that would change everything. Sarah sat across from him, her flawless beauty now seeming like a well-crafted mask. James occupied the chair next to her, his face conveying that false concern that Michael now recognized all too well. "We need to discuss the future of the company," Michael began, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. Rachel had insisted he wear a brooch, actually a hidden recording device. Bennett and his team were monitoring everything from a van parked near the building. Sarah leaned forward, her green eyes shining with a studied intensity. "Darling, are you sure you're up for this? You look so tired." "I'm better than ever," Michael replied, noticing how she and James exchanged a quick glance. "In fact, I have some important decisions to announce." Elena silently entered the room, carrying a tray with coffee. Her hands trembled slightly. Only Michael knew the weight of the role she was playing at that moment. The vial Sarah had given her earlier was in her pocket, but the drink she was serving now was harmless. "I've decided to restructure the leadership of the company," Michael continued, noticing how James adjusted himself in his chair. "The merger with Pacific Corp gives us a unique opportunity for change." The tension in the room was palpable. Sarah maintained her perfect smile, but her fingers gripped the edge of the table with enough force to make her knuckles turn white. James tried to keep a neutral expression, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "Change?" James asked, his voice controlled. "What kind of change do you have in mind?" Michael opened a folder on the table, revealing documents that Bennett had prepared. "I'm thinking of a new corporate structure. One where power is more distributed." "Michael," Sarah intervened, her voice sweet as poisoned honey, "don't you think you should wait until you're feeling better? These decisions are so important." "It's funny you mention my health, Sarah," Michael replied, his eyes locking with hers. "I've been thinking about it a lot lately. About how I started feeling sick right after our wedding." Sarah's smile faltered for a moment. James shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Margaret sends her regards," Michael continued, watching as James's face paled. "She has an impressive memory, you know? Remembers every document that passed through your hands, every whispered conversation in the halls." "Michael," James tried to interrupt, "I don't know what Margaret has been saying, but—" "And Dr. Anderson?" Michael cut in, his voice sharp. "Do you remember him, Sarah? The researcher who died so mysteriously at the lab where you worked?" The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah remained still, but her eyes had lost that calculated gleam, replaced by something colder, something more dangerous. "Or perhaps we should talk about Richard Collins?" Michael continued, spreading out the photos that Bennett had found. "It's interesting how the two of you show up in so many tragic stories." "You don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, her voice losing its artificial sweetness. "You're confused, sick?" "Sick?" Michael laughed, without humor. "Yes, I'm sick. Poisoned, to be more precise. Dr. Morgan did some very interesting tests on my blood. The same poison found in Dr. Anderson's body, did you know?" James stood up abruptly, knocking over his coffee cup. "This is absurd. You're delirious." "Sit down, James," Michael ordered, his voice carrying years of authority. To his surprise, James obeyed automatically. "Elena, why don't you show them what Sarah gave you this morning?" Elena, trembling but determined, took the vial out of her pocket. Sarah turned as white as a sheet. "I trusted you," Sarah whispered to Elena, her voice laced with threat. "And I couldn't live with this guilt," Elena replied, tears streaming down her face. Michael slowly stood up, leaning on the table. "It's over. Bennett is out there with all the proof we need. Margaret is on her way to make her official statement. Elena's already told everything. And that safe you couldn't open in my office at home? It contains copies of all the documentation proving your activities over the past 10 years. Sarah stood up gracefully, her face a mask of calm. "You don't understand, Michael. Everything we've done, it was for a greater good. The pharmaceutical industry, the corporations. Someone had to bring justice." "Justice?" Michael felt his anger rise in his chest. "You call murder justice? Manipulation? Betrayal?" "You'll never understand," James interjected, his voice bitter. "Living in your privileged world, you've never seen what the big corporations do to innocent people. So you've become exactly what you claim to fight against," Michael replied. "Killing for money, destroying lives for power." The sound of doors opening interrupted the conversation. Bennett entered the room followed by 2 police officers. Sarah and James remained surprisingly calm, as if they had been expecting this moment. "Sarah Thompson and James Parker," Bennett announced formally, You are under arrest for the murder of Dr. Thomas Anderson, Richard Collins, and the attempted murder of Michael Thompson. As the police made the arrests, Michael watched Sarah's face, that face he had once loved, now revealing its true nature. There was no remorse in her eyes, only a cold acceptance. "You were never the final target, Michael," she said softly as she was handcuffed. "You were just another rung on our ladder. But I made a mistake. I let you live too long." Her words hit Michael like a punch to the stomach. Rachel, who had entered the room quietly, placed a hand on his shoulder in support. As Sarah and James were taken away, Michael sat heavily in his chair. Elena silently cried in a corner, Bennett was sorting through documents with the officers, and Rachel stayed by his side, a constant and comforting presence. "It's over," Rachel said softly. "No," Michael replied, looking out the window at the city, which continued with its normal life outside. "Now it begins. I have a company to rebuild, lives to fix." The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. It was the end of a dark era, but also the beginning of something new. Michael knew that recovery would be long, both physically and emotionally, but for the first time in months he felt like he could breathe freely again. "You're not alone," Rachel reminded him, her voice full of promise. Michael looked at her, realizing how his heart warmed at that simple truth. Amidst all the betrayal and darkness, he had found people who proved that kindness still existed. Elena, who chose her conscience over greed. Bennett, with his tireless pursuit of justice. And Rachel, who never stopped believing in him. Night fell over the city, marking the end of an empire built on lies and the beginning of something more real, more genuine. Michael Thompson had lost so much, his marriage, his trust, his certainties, but in the process he had found something more valuable, his own truth. 3 months had passed since the arrest of Sarah and James. The Thompson mansion, once a symbol of status and power, now seemed too large, too empty. Michael ran a hand through his gray hair as he watched the first rays of morning sunlight touch the garden through the kitchen window. The coffee in his cup exhaled a comforting aroma, brewed by his own hands, a small act of independence that had become significant. Rachel appeared in the kitchen doorway, her white coat replaced with casual clothes. In the past few months she had become more than just a doctor or friend. She was his pillar of strength, a constant presence helping him rebuild his life piece by piece. "You seem thoughtful today," she said, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. "I've been rereading Margaret's letters," Michael replied, his voice soft. She described in detail how James pressured her, how he used fear to silence her. But she chose to speak out anyway. "Her courage made me think about how much time I wasted being afraid to trust again." The trial of Sarah and James had revealed a web of manipulation and crimes that stretched back over a decade. Other victims began to surface, similar stories of betrayal and poisoning that had been carefully covered up. Elena, with her brave testimony, had been instrumental in uncovering the entire scheme. "I received news from Pacific Corp this morning," Michael continued, a small smile forming on his lips. "They want to go ahead with the merger but on my terms. They say they admire how I handled the whole situation." Rachel smiled, her eyes full of pride. "You turned a personal tragedy into an opportunity to do the right thing. Not every CEO would choose full transparency after a scandal like that." Michael stood up, walking over to the window. The garden, which Sarah used to maintain with artificial perfection, now had a more natural, truer appearance. Just like his own life. "I have a meeting with the team today," he said, turning to Rachel. "We're going to implement new security protocols across all the companies in the group. Elena is helping to develop a protection program for whistleblowers." Elena had transformed over the past few months. From a frightened, manipulated secretary, she emerged as a strong woman determined to make amends for her mistakes. Her personal experience became the foundation for significant changes in the company's corporate culture. The most ironic part, Michael reflected, is that Sarah and James claim to be fighting against corporate corruption, but their actions only prove that true change comes from honesty, not revenge. Rachel moved closer, placing a gentle hand on his arm. The simple touch carried a comfort that words couldn't express. "How is your heart today?" she asked, and both knew she wasn't just referring to his physical health. "It's healing," Michael replied honestly. "Each day gets a little easier. It still hurts to think about how I was deceived, but now I can see beyond the betrayal. I see the people who stayed by my side, who risked everything for the truth." A sound of footsteps interrupted the conversation. Bennett appeared at the door carrying a folder. Even after the case had officially closed, he continued to investigate, uncovering more connections, more victims in need of justice. "Good morning," he greeted, his smile tired but satisfied. "I've brought the latest updates on the case. And some interesting news about James' former network of contacts." The three sat down at the kitchen table, a habit they had developed over the past few months. This same table, where Sarah once served poisoned coffee, was now the setting for honest conversations and plans for a better future. "We found records of other companies they targeted," Bennett explained, spreading documents across the table. "But we also uncovered something surprising. People who resisted their attempts at manipulation, who chose integrity over greed." Michael looked over the documents, recognizing names and companies. Each page revealed not only crimes but also stories of moral resistance, people who refused to be corrupted. "We're creating a support network," he explained. "Connecting survivors, sharing stories, turning pain into purpose. Thompson Enterprises will no longer be known for the scandal, but for the change it sparked in the industry." Rachel watched how Michael's eyes lit up as he spoke about his plans. The transformation she saw in him was profound. From the victim who nearly succumbed to poison to the leader who used his experience to protect others. "You know," she said softly, "when we first met, I feared you wouldn't survive. Not just the poison but the betrayal. Some people never recover from a breach of trust that deep." Michael reached for her hand across the table, a gesture that had become natural between them. "I survived because I wasn't alone. You, Bennett, Elena, Margaret, each of you showed me that there are still people I can trust." Bennett smiled, watching the interaction between the two. "Speaking of trust," he remarked, "that charity dinner for the new foundation is this weekend, right?" Michael nodded. The Thompson Foundation for Corporate Ethics had been born out of his personal experience. A project to promote corporate transparency and protect whistleblowers. "Rachel, would you do me the honor of accompanying me?" Michael asked, his voice carrying a mix of hope and vulnerability that only she could stir. Her smile lit up the kitchen. "I thought you'd never ask." Bennett chuckled, standing up from the table. "Well, that's my cue to leave. I've got a few more leads to follow up on." After Bennett left, Michael and Rachel remained in the kitchen, the silence between them comfortable, filled with unspoken promises. The morning sunlight now bathed the room entirely, pushing away the last shadows. "You know," Michael said, "for years I thought success meant power, money, status. Sarah and James used that belief against me. But now I understand that true success is having real people by your side, people who choose to stay even knowing your vulnerabilities." Rachel gently squeezed his hand. "And true love is choosing to trust again even after being deeply hurt." Michael felt his heart warm at her words. The pain of betrayal was still there, a scar he would always carry, but it was no longer the dominant force in his life. In place of the poison that had nearly destroyed him, he found a more powerful antidote. The courage to remain open to love, trust, and the possibility of starting anew. The phone rang. It was Elena, reminding him of the upcoming meeting. Life went on with its challenges and opportunities. But now, Michael Thompson faced each day not as a battle for survival, but as a chance to create something meaningful from the ashes of his former life. As he prepared to leave, Michael glanced at Rachel one more time. In her eyes he saw not just the present, but a future full of possibilities. A future built not on elaborate lies, but on the solid foundation of truth, regained trust and love that grows naturally, like the flowers now blooming freely in his garden. A year had passed since that fateful afternoon in the office. The Thompson Enterprises event hall glowed with a soft light as Michael observed the guests at the foundation's inaugural event. Each face there represented a story of overcoming, each person a testament that darkness could give way to light. Margaret, his former secretary, was chatting animatedly with Elena in a corner of the hall. The two women had developed an unlikely friendship, united by the courage to face the truth. Elena was no longer just a secretary, she now ran the foundation's whistleblower protection program, turning her own experience into hope for others. "It's still strange to see so many people here," Rachel commented softly, appearing at Michael's side. Her navy blue dress contrasted with the white of the lab coat he had come to associate with salvation. The mansions never had so much life. Michael smiled, noticing how his hand naturally found hers. The former house, which for so long had been the stage for lies, now housed a greater purpose. The rooms, once suffocating with poisonous secrets, now overflowed with honest conversations and genuine laughter. Bennett crossed the hall toward them, carrying a folder Michael knew all too well. "The latest reports are in," he said, his face tired but satisfied. 3 more companies have adopted our corporate transparency program. The domino effect continues." Michael took the folder, but his eyes were drawn to the group of people gathered near the fireplace. "Survivors, that's what they called themselves. Men and women who, like him, had faced betrayal at the hands of Sarah and James but chose to turn their pain into purpose. "Sometimes I wonder," Michael said quietly, "if I should thank Sarah and James. Without them, we would have never created all of this." Rachel gently squeezed his hand. "You turned poison into medicine. It's not about them, it's about who you chose to become after what they did." The sound of clinking glasses drew everyone's attention. It was time for the opening speech. Michael walked up to the small makeshift stage, feeling the weight of the gazes but no longer as a burden. Every person there knew his story, understood his journey. "A year ago," he began, his voice firm and clear, "I believed trust was a weakness. That power meant control, that success was measured in numbers in a bank account." He paused, his eyes finding Rachel's in the crowd. "I was slowly dying, not just from the poison in my blood, but from the loneliness I had built around myself." The silence in the room was absolute, every word resonating with the personal experiences of those present. "But then I discovered that sometimes we need to lose everything to find what truly matters. Every person in this room has a story of loss, betrayal, and pain. But we also have stories of courage, of true friendship, of love that blooms in the most unexpected places." His eyes scanned the room, recognizing each face. Elena, who found her voice when it mattered most. Margaret, who chose truth even under threats. Bennett, whose tireless quest for justice revealed not just criminals, but everyday heroes. The Thompson Foundation is not just about preventing corporate crimes or protecting whistleblowers. It's about creating spaces where truth can flourish, where people can reconnect with their own humanity. It's about turning scars into maps that guide us to a better future. Rachel smiled through her tears, her face reflecting the pride and love Michael had learned to recognize and accept. Beside her, Bennett nodded in silent approval. "Each of you carries a story of transformation. Together, we are proving that the antidote to betrayal is not isolation, but connection. That the answer to poison is no longer more poison, but the courage to remain open to love." Michael raised his glass, and hundreds of others followed suit. "To the truth that sets us free. To the friendships that save us. And to the love that transforms us." The toast echoed through the hall, but it was more than just a social gesture. It was a celebration of human resilience, of the ability to rise from the ashes of betrayal. After the speech, while the guests returned to their conversations, Michael found a quiet moment with Rachel in the garden. The stars shone above them, silent witnesses to how much their lives had changed. "You know what impresses me most?" Rachel asked, her face illuminated by the moonlight. "It's not just your physical recovery. It's how you chose to use your experience to help others, to create something meaningful." Michael gently touched her face. "I learned that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as tragedies. You taught me that, Rachel. You and every person who chose to stand by my side when everything was falling apart." The sound of laughter came from the hall, a melody of life and hope that had replaced the poisonous silence of the past. The Thompson mansion, once a golden prison, was now a beacon of hope for people seeking fresh starts. "We still have a lot of work ahead," Michael reflected, looking at the city lights in the distance. "But for the first time in a long while, I'm not afraid of the future." Rachel intertwined her fingers with his, a simple gesture that carried the promise of all the tomorrows to come. "And you're not alone on this journey anymore." The gentle night breeze carried the scent of the garden flowers, a garden that, like Michael's life, had been transformed. No longer trimmed into artificial shapes, it now grew freely and truly, its wildflowers a testament to the beauty that can emerge when we allow nature to follow its course. Michael Thompson's story was no longer just about survival. It was about rebirth, about the courage to trust again, about the strength we find when we choose to turn our wounds into wisdom. And as he and Rachel walked back to the celebration, Michael knew he had found not just a new purpose, but a new way of living. A life based not on appearances and power, but on genuine connections and authentic love. Dear viewers, if you were moved by this story of overcoming and transformation, leave your thoughts below. Your opinions mean so much to us. If you'd like to hear more intense stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe to the Life Stories channel. Your support helps us continue bringing inspiring stories that touch hearts and change lives. Until the next story.